All right, well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Michael Bresnick. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force. And I'd like to start out by thanking Georgetown University Law Center for hosting this very special event that we've had and are having here today, and for allowing so many influential leaders throughout the Department of Justice, and in fact from more than 20 different federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and offices, as well as 9 different consumer protection groups, to gather together under one roof to talk about critical issues that affect millions of Americans all across the country every day. 4 weeks ago today, United States Attorney General Eric Holder announced the creation of the Consumer Protection Group, punctuating his deep commitment to preventing and prosecuting fraud against some of our most vulnerable citizens. And during his time as Attorney General, he has charged civil attorneys and criminal prosecutors to use all the resources in their arsenal to enhance their enforcement of consumer fraud. These efforts have been met with tremendous success. Under Attorney General Holder's leadership and fierce resolve to protect consumers, we have forged strong partnerships with the consumer advocates here today, and we will continue to do so through the Consumer Protection Working Group and events like this one. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure and an honor for me now to introduce this afternoon's first speaker, the United States Attorney General, Eric Holder.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Oh, come on, there we go. Thank you, Mike, for that kind introduction and for your leadership as the Executive Director of the President's Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force. You're doing really a superb job. It's a pleasure to join with you and with so many dedicated colleagues and essential partners as we begin today's really important conversations. Now, I want to thank you all, especially our distinguished panelists, for being a part of what I think is truly a historic summit. I can think of no better way to commemorate and to raise awareness of Consumer Protection Week than for this group of stakeholders, this group of experts and advocates to join forces in examining the challenges that we face and identifying the solutions that the American people deserve. Now, in this conversation, I'm especially grateful for the commitment and the engagement of the members of the Consumer Protection Working Group, which is a newly formed initiative that's opening as part of the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force. And in particular, I'd like to recognize Director Michael Bloom of the Consumer Protection Branch and all of the group's co-chairs, Assistant Attorney General Tony West of the Civil Division, who's soon to be our Associate Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General Lanny Brewer of the Criminal Division of the Justice Department, U.S. Attorney Andre Barat of the Central District of California, and in case you don't know, that's Los Angeles, Director David Vladeck of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, and Kent Marcus, an old friend and the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He's the Director of Enforcement. Today, as the working group gathers for the second time since its inaugural meeting in February, I want to express my gratitude for your leadership of this effort and for your dedication in protecting the health, safety, and the economic security of consumers across the country. These are goals and these are responsibilities that we all share, and each one of us has a role in fulfilling them. For me, and for today's Department of Justice, protecting American consumers is a top priority. And as we have rededicated ourselves to this work in recent years, we've also learned some essential lessons. Primarily, that fully understanding the threats that consumers face and protecting their interests in a comprehensive way is not something that the Justice Department can achieve on its own. We cannot simply prosecute our way out of this problem. So we need your help. We need your perspective. We need your expertise. We need your talents. We need your determination. And that's precisely what this day is all about. Earlier this afternoon, we kicked off an important and I think in some ways unprecedented conversation between this working group's leaders and key consumer advocates. We talked about strategies for enhancing our civil and criminal enforcement of consumer fraud crimes, increasing public awareness about common schemes and ways to report them, so that ordinary citizens have the knowledge that they need to fight back, and building on the momentum that we've established in the fight against consumer fraud. Now, as a result of discussions like this one, and thanks to the strong partnerships that we have forged with federal law enforcement officials, regulatory agencies, as well as key state and local authorities, we've been able to gain access to the wide array of tools and the extraordinary depth of experience that we will need, not just to continue the work that is underway, but to bring this fight to the next level. Especially in these times of great economic challenges, I recognize that the need to move aggressively to combat these crimes has never been more important. And that's why I'm proud to report that our nation's Department of Justice and so many of the consumer groups represented here have responded to these threats not with despair, but with resolve and with decisive action. During the last fiscal year, the Department's Consumer Protection Branch achieved an astounding 95% conviction rate. They recovered over $900 million in criminal and civil fines, and they obtained sentences totaling over 125 years of imprisonment against more than 30 individuals. These achievements build on the remarkable success of the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force, which has helped secure convictions against those responsible for a wide variety of consumer scams, including telemarketing schemes, fraudulent job training and referral services, and even an enterprise that generated over $75 million in loss and victimized 350,000 small businesses by placing unauthorized charges on people's phone bills. Since last April, when I established a new part of the task force known as the Oil and Gas Price Fraud Working Group, we have also been focused on identifying civil or criminal violations in the oil and gasoline markets and ensuring that American consumers are not harmed by unlawful conduct. This working group's latest meeting was held at the Justice Department just this morning, and its members discussed a variety of topics, including the role of speculators in the market, recent reports and enforcement matters by various working group members, such as the FTC and the New York State Attorney General's Office, as well as ways to improve information sharing between working group members and partners, and where do we go from here? I can also report that one of the working group's members, the Federal Trade Commission, is currently conducting an investigation with assistance from other working group members into whether gas prices have been affected by any antitrust violation or market manipulation by refiners or oil producers or transporters, marketers, physical or financial traders, or others. Working group members stand ready to act if the FTC learns anything that implicates the laws that they enforce. The task force has also been at the forefront of the administration's efforts to seek justice for those who were devastated by the recent financial crisis. Since 2009, we have helped to bring charges, to secure convictions, and to obtain prison sentences of up to 60 years in a variety of cases charging securities fraud, bank fraud, and investment fraud, using criminal enforcement tools where possible and civil penalties and sanctions where necessary. I think we have made great strides in holding individuals and institutions accountable for the reckless, inappropriate, and awful, and oftentimes unlawful conduct that helped contribute to the financial crisis. And by employing a similar collaborative approach, we've even been able to make history. In January, the Departments of Justice and Housing and Urban Development, other agencies, and 49 state attorneys general came together to achieve a landmark $25 billion agreement with the nation's top 5 mortgage servicers, the largest joint federal-state settlement on record. This will provide really significant assistance to struggling homeowners and communities, and it will serve as a model for what we can accomplish when we work together across federal agencies, state boundaries, and even across party lines, and through another new task force component known as the Residential Mortgage-Backed Securities Working Group. Now, we can all be encouraged by the achievements that have characterized the past few years, but there is perhaps no better illustration of the progress we've made than our groundbreaking work to combat healthcare fraud. Over the last fiscal year alone, the department and its partners were able to recover nearly $4.1 billion in funds that were stolen or taken improperly from federal health care programs, the highest amount ever recorded in a single year. And over the last 3 years, for every dollar that we have spent fighting against health care fraud, we've returned an average of $7 to the United States Treasury, the Medicare Trust Fund, and others. Now, these numbers are stunning, There's no question that we should all be proud of the results that we have already achieved. And although the healthcare fraud won't be a focal point of this working group, this ongoing work will continue to augment our latest consumer protection efforts. But I also know that this is no time to be satisfied, and we cannot afford to become complacent. And that's why we must and we will continue to seek new avenues for communication and collaboration with partners like you. With the assistance and expertise of the friends and allies that have gathered here today, and through discussions like those that will take place this afternoon on issues ranging from fraud targeting the elderly to common tax schemes to business opportunity fraud, we will develop comprehensive strategies and implement innovative new solutions to preventing and combating consumer fraud in the years ahead. And to put it simply, my colleagues and I are counting on each and every one of you. American consumers are depending on you, and I look forward to all that we will be able to accomplish together. So thank you all very much for the great work that you're doing and that you will do. Thank you.
Thank you, General Holder, and thanks all of you for joining us here today at Happy National Consumer Protection Week. This week is really an opportunity for us to do a number of things, to raise the awareness about consumer protection issues with consumers around the country, to begin to think about our own efforts, enforcement efforts, education efforts, when it comes to protecting consumers from fraud and scams. But I think the most important thing that this week is proving to be is an opportunity for us to come together and to share ideas, thoughts, to achieve some synergies, talk about efficiencies that we can achieve by working together. And we've already started to do that this morning. We had a very productive meeting with consumer advocates who have been in this fight for a long time, and with federal partners and state partners to talk about how we can work better as a team tackling some of these issues. As the Attorney General mentioned, protecting the health, safety, and financial well-being of consumers has really been a centerpiece of this administration's anti-fraud efforts. And over the last 3 years, we in the Civil Division of the Department of Justice, we've refocused and redoubled and really reorganized our efforts to protect consumers by creating a new branch, the Consumer Protection Branch. And the work of that branch, which the Attorney General mentioned in his remarks, it's really been going on for the last 40 years. But what we have done is and they've been enforcing federal consumer protection statutes for a long time. But what we have done over the last 3 years is we have provided additional resources. We have given that branch an expanded focus, and we have renewed partnerships with key players in the consumer protection space so that our efforts are even more effective today. We enjoy great partnerships with the FTC and the FDA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, our new friends at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, State Attorneys General, great strong partnerships with U.S. attorneys around the country, and several others. And we have really, through these partnerships, stepped up our efforts to enforce consumer protection laws in a number of areas, including mortgage fraud, food and product safety, counterfeit pharmaceuticals, investor rip-off schemes, which are better known as business opportunity frauds. There'll be a panel on that a little bit later on today. Criminal off-label marketing, healthcare fraud. Our interest grows in for-profit colleges. And notarial fraud is another area of growing interest type of fraud that really preys on immigrant communities. And as the Attorney General mentioned, those redoubled efforts have really led to some record-breaking results. And again, that's really a testament to the partnerships that we've been able to establish. He told you about last year's numbers. When you look at the numbers from January 2009, you'll see that the Consumer Protection Branch in its efforts has recovered a record-breaking $3.72 billion in criminal fines, civil penalties, restitution to victims. When you add up the sentences of the defendants who've been convicted during the 3-year period, you find it cumulatively adds up to more than 295 years. So it is a record of success, but again, as the Attorney General has said, we have much more work to do, and that's why this gathering is so important. And so the last thing I'll say in closing before I turn it over to my friend and colleague Lanny Brewer is, one of the things that happens in Washington, D.C. when people hear a new working group is they think, oh, a new working group. What is that? Whoopee, right? Well, let me tell you something. One of the things that I think we have seen time and again with the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force and the working groups that have been formed under it, whether it's the Mortgage Fraud Working Group, which I have had the great privilege to work on, or the RMBS Working Group, or some of the other working groups that Lanny has participated in and those of us in this room have participated on. The reason we form these working groups is because they work. They have really led to very significant results when people are coming together, people who are focusing on similar enforcement challenges, and we are bringing together the full panoply of federal and civil and criminal and state authorities to bear on these common problems. And when you add to that in this context, bringing in the ideas of so many consumer advocates, I think that we have a recipe for success again. And so I'm very, very pleased that all of you were here. It's really a privilege to be able to be engaged in this effort with you. And with that, let me introduce the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division, my friend and colleague, Lanny Brewer.
Well, thank you, Tony. I just want to echo what Tony was just saying. I mean, the working groups are only as good as the people who are involved. And they're only as good as our willingness to deal with the issues at hand and try to find as comprehensive approach as we can. My view of all of these issues is the same, that to some degree we have different topic areas, but on some level, all different levels of fraud and criminality morph. They morph both nationally and internationally, and they morph candidly by the subject matter. So right now what the working group does is exactly what Tony says. It gives us an opportunity to have real discussions with real experts. We started hearing from people earlier today. And I think at least my criminal division will be better as a result because we're going to start focusing. And to give you a very real example, I grabbed already one of my deputy chiefs of one of my section based on a couple of the points made just earlier today and said I wanted us to deal with the issue in the very same way that a few weeks ago in the residential mortgage-backed security group, in exchanging ideas with others, we were able to come up with a holistic approach to the new area. What we need to do is we need to raise awareness. And we have to understand that fraud, particularly at a time of financial distress, when people are feeling more vulnerable, is a time when people are absolutely at their most vulnerable and at greatest risk of fraud. We also have to be realistic that crime today is global, and we also have to be realistic that more and more today organized groups will sometimes perpetuate fraud. So one of our goals in the criminal division and with our partners are to try to identify who are committing these crimes and how are they committing them. Well, one thing we know is that some crime, a fair bit of consumer-related crime, is internationally based. It's not always here. Sometimes fraudsters realize that they can better escape law enforcement if they do it abroad, and so we're trying to deal with our international partners. In that vein, I've been to West Africa to talk to our partners in West Africa about what we need to do. It's why we're fighting harder to extradite people when we identify them. It's why I was recently in Romania to talk with our partners there, where Romania has been an incredibly strong partner with us in dealing with identity theft and identity fraud and many of the kinds of scams that we're all here to talk about. Jonathan Rush, someone from my office, is here, and one of the areas that we, of course, identify a lot is with disaster relief fraud. Since Katrina, we learned, unfortunately, that Americans and others have huge hearts. And so when people call up and say, look, I'm raising money because of this calamity, could you just donate money? People do. And so we created at LSU a comprehensive approach where we have agents from all different law enforcement entities and prosecutors and hotlines, and it's worked. We haven't eradicated disaster relief fraud, but we have prosecuted many, many people. We've received very high sentences. We've educated people. And just this week and last week, with the tornadoes that ravaged part of the United States, we immediately started a new educational campaign. As Tony said, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to keep learning and trying to do more and more. We're going to try to educate those who are most vulnerable. Sometimes in these kinds of times, we know people are embarrassed that they were scammed. Maybe they were embarrassed because they donated money or gave money because they thought that their life's partner, who they'd never met, but who they thought was their kindred spirit, needed money. Or maybe it's an elderly person who was defrauded in thinking a relative or a grandkid had asked for money and so gave money, and of course it was the furthest from that. So we have to together figure out how we can help our most vulnerable. We in the criminal division have identified these boiler rooms in Costa Rica where criminals from the United States and other places go, and literally 24 hours a day they man phones with one kind of consumer fraud after another. You've won the lottery, just send us this much money. A relative of yours has suffered a disaster, just send us this much money. But we've extradited those people. One of them was just recently sentenced to 30 years in jail. A whole group of others were sentenced to between 4 and 10 years in jail. And as the Attorney General said, prison has to be a component. And then lastly, in our partnerships, such as with the terrific U.S. Attorney from the Central District, Andre Barat, we took down a group called Armenian Power. It's an organized crime group. It's an organized gang. They're a violent gang, but they also engage in identity theft and consumer fraud. And through their schemes, we went after them, and we're prosecuting them and have prosecuted their leadership. So like Tony, I'm glad I and my team will be able to hear from folks today. We're going to keep working forward, and we're going to keep holding those who would perpetuate these kinds of frauds responsible. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kent Marcus. I'm the head of the Enforcement Division at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We're the new kids on the block. I was thinking today as we were meeting with some of the consumer advocates that we probably, at less than 1 year old, we have probably been doing this for about as many days as the collective group of people have been doing it for years. So we're gratified to be invited to join in these efforts. We come to the table in these efforts with a wonderful array of tools, and part of our objective is to try and think creatively about how we will use that set of tools that we've been provided by the Congress. We have the ability to engage in supervision, enforcement, rulemaking, consumer engagement, consumer response. And all of these tools together, I think, help us be more effective in the way we do the work that we're all engaged in. The references that several of us have made about the earlier session with the consumer advocates, I thought yielded a good example of where that kind of collaborative activity is both necessary and justified. It was, I thought, striking in those discussions that the single topic raised most frequently in that group as to what was an area of concern was illegal and fraudulent conduct associated with debt collection. And it was a topic over and over and over as we were talking earlier today. Earlier this week, our director, Rich Cordray, indicated in a speech to the state attorneys general that he thought this posed an opportunity and a challenge that we should all collectively take on together. That there has been outstanding work that has been done with respect to efforts to undermine illegal and fraudulent conduct associated with debt collection. The FTC has brought more cases in the last year than in any recent time in anybody's memory, maybe ever. They have done that in substantial collaboration with the Justice Department and with the United States attorneys. The attorneys general across the country have been working on bringing debt collection cases consistently and regularly over the years. And yet, in a meeting with consumer advocates today, it was the single topic that drew the most attention. What that says to us is we need to together and collectively look for ways to do things in new ways, in different ways, to utilize new tools, new concepts, new ideas, about how we can try and bring about the kinds of changes that we would all like to see. And not only in this area, for I use the debt collection example as simply an example of the many areas in which we need to do the kind of collaborative work that others have referred to. So I want to indicate that we are both humbled and thankful about joining with all of these colleagues who have been working for substantial time on these difficult issues, and we have generally appreciated the welcoming and generous way that we have been invited to the table to help fight against consumer fraud and violations of consumer laws along with all of them. And so with that and with our commitment to bring our new tools, our new energy, and our new resources to the table joining everyone, let me then introduce my friend David Vladeck, the Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission.
So I am David Vladeck, the Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection. Marcus may be the new kid on the block. We're the old guys on the block. The FTC is the nation's oldest consumer protection agency with both a consumer protection and competition mandate. Over the last 3 years, we focused our resources on what we call last dollar frauds. These are frauds aimed at taking the last dollar out of the wallets of people rendered vulnerable by the economic downturn. Now, we do all sorts of things other than enforcement. We do rulemaking, we do policy initiatives, we do tremendous consumer ed work, which is available at our website, www.ftc.gov. But I want to talk about our enforcement cases because the commitment that Tony spoke about earlier and Attorney General Holder spoke about earlier, I think really deserves a moment of reflection. I've been doing consumer protection work for the last 35 years. Never before have the federal agencies involved in consumer protection met with consumer advocates, heard them, and made the commitments that the government is making today. Tony's forces have grown exponentially. We have Kent and the new CFPB on the block. We finally have the resources to play offense, not just defense. So I want to talk briefly about the FTC's enforcement mission. When we bring an enforcement case, we have 3 goals. Stop the fraud. Get whatever money we can find and return it to consumers, and then refer it to Lanny, Tony, and Andre, and hope that the Justice Department puts these guys in jail. So let me talk briefly about the breadth of our enforcement work. As long as we're gripped with this economic downturn, homeowners are going to be in default or facing foreclosure. That's a breeding ground for abuse by fraudsters. Earlier this week, we filed our 35th case against hundreds of defendants engaged in loan mod scams. And we will continue to do this work at a high volume until we root this problem out. Mortgage servicing. Yes, there was a tremendously good settlement against the top 5. There are more mortgage servicers out there who need to see the federal government. We're working. I know the CFPB and the Department of Justice are also working on these issues. Debt. Debt is in terms of resources the largest issue we confront, and we confront it in multiple ways. One is there are a lot of debt settlement scams. If you listen to the TV at night, here's the come on. If you owe more than $10,000 worth of debt, call us. We'll renegotiate your interest. We'll pay down your principal. Most of those are scams. We just finished a huge trial in Dallas against 2 of the largest ones. We're now up to more than 20 cases in this area, but this is an issue that will not go away. Phantom debt. Increasingly, people are complaining that they are being called by debt collectors and they owe no debt. Often these are people who've searched for payday loans online. All of a sudden they're getting calls from call centers in India, we know where they are, trying to force people to pay debts they don't owe with threats of arrest and imprisonment. We've shut down 10 of them in one case we filed 2 weeks ago. There's more of this litigation to go. Debt collection. We filed 8 cases in the last year, and we've got more to come. Debt collection abuse remains the largest single complaint we get at the Federal Trade Commission. Kent is right. We've been fighting this and with the cooperation of the Justice Department, but the complaints still go up. We will be doing more enforcement in this. We're also going after debt buyers. There's a new industry out there. Stale debt used to just sort of be written off. Now we call it zombie debt because we can't kill it. And debt collectors are collecting stale debt. With the great assistance of the Justice Department, we just settled a case against the largest debt buyer, Asset Acceptance, requiring it to let consumers know that the debt is past statute of limitations before they try to collect on the debt. And we are very grateful to the Justice Department's help in this case. Payday lending. Payday lending abuse is on the rise, and payday lenders are now hiding offshore or residing on Indian tribes and claiming tribal immunity. We filed a big case against one of these tribal payday loan operations last week. There's more to come. Job scams and business opportunities. With the unemployment rate still stubbornly high, people out of work or working or want to find extra pay, job scams and business scams have proliferated. There's going to be a panel on that later this afternoon that will talk about our work. Fake government scams, fake government grant scams, still ongoing even though the stimulus program is over. We've talked about this before, but wire fraud scams, fake check, grandparent scams, lottery, sweepstakes, contest scams, they're proliferating. We're going after them not only by going to the scammers and then turning them over to Lanny's folks for prosecution, but also going to the wire transfer companies that enable this. We have an order against MoneyGram. We've been working closely with Western Union to combat those frauds. Precious metal scams, robo scams, telemarketing scams, cramming. I could go on, but our mission until the economy brightens is going to be going after these last dollar scammers, shutting them down, taking whatever assets we can, and then turning over to the Justice Department so they become guests of state. Thanks so much. Let me introduce my colleague, Andre Barat, who's the U.S. Attorney in L.A. and is a very good partner of the FCC's. We're very grateful for Andre's work.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I bring greetings from sunny and extremely warmer Los Angeles. So it is a privilege to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon. I look forward to engaging and learning a lot from you here this afternoon. As mentioned, I'm the United States Attorney in the Central District of Los Angeles. It is the most populous district in the country, representing almost 18 million people. And with a district with so many consumers, it is unfortunately home to the variety of targets and crimes and scams that you have heard about today. Some examples include your foreclosure or loan modification scams that prey on homeowners who have fallen on hard times, your advanced loan schemes that target the small businesses in our district, importers of counterfeit goods who skirt safety regulations to sell to low-income neighborhoods, your abusive tax preparers who target low-income taxpayers and skim the inflated refunds, and your fraudulent immigration practitioners who charge based on false promises, those notario fraud, as Tony West mentioned. And I could go on and on and on about the different scams that go on in our district. But I want to tell you that we have been very proactive, not only in the Central District of California, but throughout the nation. And our colleagues throughout the U.S. Attorney's offices have been working very diligently on this effort. Our objective is relatively simple. It's to investigate these crimes, to educate the public about these scams, and to hold those responsible, those individuals, accountable. So let me give you some concrete examples of what these scam artists, or what I call these scum artists, really do on a day-to-day basis. Just last week in the Central District of California, we charged an identity theft case in which a defendant was alleged to have stolen credit cards and bank account numbers from more than 600 victims by sending out phishing emails that looked like legitimate banks asking for updated personal information. In January of this year, a father and son were each sentenced to more than 150 months in federal prison in order to pay $39 million in restitution for running a scam that defrauded more than 1,000 victims with the promises of large returns on investment in companies that were developing films in Los Angeles. Last month, a corporation in Los Angeles was ordered to pay a fine of $1 million because they were mislabeling Vietnamese catfish and spawning it off as grouper and selling it throughout the country. And then last year, a Santa Barbara man was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for conducting a phony secret shopper business, an opportunity scam that included offers to make people bartenders in our district, with defrauding 87,000 victims in the district to the tune of $6 million. Now, those are just some examples that we've had in the courtroom, but our victories in the courtroom are not all that we need to do as it relates to combating consumer fraud. In the coming weeks and months, you will see U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country working with our partners, both on the civil side, the regulatory side, and consumer groups to deal with these issues. In many cases, quite frankly, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, and we want to provide the consumers the tools that they need and educate them as to the scams that are going on throughout the country. And the only way I think we can do that is by working with good people like you here today, to exchange information, to educate each other, and then hopefully develop some strategies to go out and target this type of conduct that's going on throughout our nation. As I often say, we are only as good as the information that we receive, and as mentioned earlier, the information we received in the earlier session was quite productive and informative, and I know I have a lot to bring back to my district and start thinking of different game plans, and I will share that with my colleagues throughout the country. So I look forward to hearing from all of you today, and I look forward to the great work that we will continue to do to ultimately achieve the goal of protecting our consumers. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Andre, David, Ken, Tony, Lanny. And now, if other than David, if you don't mind stepping down, allow our panelists to come up to the stage, and we can begin with the next portion of our summit. Ladies and gentlemen, the next portion of the summit will be a panel on fraud on the elderly. The moderator will be Michael Bloom, the director of the consumer branch of the Civil Division. The panelists will be David Zlatic, you just heard from, Elizabeth Kossel, director of Consumer and State Affairs of AARP, Naomi Karp from the Office of Older Americans Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Jonathan J. Rush, Deputy Chief for Strategy and Policy, Fraud Section at the Criminal Division, Department of Justice, Jeffrey Seeger, the Senior Litigation Counsel from the Consumer Protection Branch, the Civil Division, Department of Justice, and Abby Kuzma, the Director of Consumer Protection in the Office of the Indiana Attorney General. And with that, I give you Michael Bloom, our moderator. Thank you.
Well, thanks, folks, and good afternoon. This panel, I suspect, will be very interesting and informative, and let's just get right to it. We are going to talk about fraud directed at the elderly. And it seems to me a natural question is why do we have a special panel on fraud on the elderly? And there is research that concerns particular vulnerabilities that older folks may have that make them more susceptible than others to certain kinds of frauds. And I'd like to start then with Betsy about some of the research that the AARP may have done concerning those kinds of vulnerabilities. And if you could give us some of those factors that make older folks more vulnerable, perhaps, to the frauds we've been talking about so far today.
Yes, and it's on. Okay. I wanted first to put it in perspective. There are not a great many statistics about how many elderly are victimized, but we know that elderly financial abuse is dramatically underreported. Maybe 24 people are victimized for every one that's reported to any kind of a criminal or social service agency. And it's probably the most pervasive form of elderly abuse and mistreatment. Among New York did a survey of people who were 60 and older, and 41 out of 1,000 had suffered this type of abuse. And this didn't include people who were cognitively impaired, which I will get to in a minute. The Investor Protection Trust surveyed older people and their children and found that 20% of those over 65 had been taken advantage of financially through an inappropriate investment, unreasonably high fees, or outright fraud. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights shows that 45% of scam victims were over 50, and they incurred 41% of the losses with these foreclosure rescue scams. One thing we'd like to, which we have not been able to research, it just hasn't been out there, is better statistics on this. MetLife had a report where they estimated at least almost $3 million had been lost, and that 51% of it was embezzled by strangers and 34% by family, friends, people in the same church or neighbors, people they knew. And I'm looking forward to the business opportunity fraud because a lot of older people have lost their jobs and they've been unemployed longer than they've ever been before. So we have done research, and my friend Naomi Karp is going to talk about one of the reports because although the CFPB stole her, she did work at AARP and she basically wrote the report. But it's called Protecting Older Investors, the Challenge at Diminished Capacity. It's out there in the hall, both the whole report, and then if you just want a short version of it, that's also there. And it surveyed and summarized some of the data and tried to find out what financial advisors, those dealing with clients directly, and the compliance officers, and how they tried to handle the problem on the investment side. And I know that Naomi will carry this further. I don't always have good news to bring you. We had a very well-designed project that came out of the West Virginia office where they bought these sucker lists. These are the same, I don't know where they come from. That's at least something that should be investigated. I know there used to be the New Widows list, but I think they're much broader now. And so these AARP volunteers were given these sucker lists. They called the people in one-to-one and spent time trying to train them to resist telephone fraud, stranger fraud. And they tried various messages, and they found the one that seemed to work the best was giving them a strategy to respond at each step of the fraud. And they did try to, this is a very, took a lot of people to do this. This is an expensive thing to do, even though we were using volunteers. And they wanted to see if they could teach those on the phone to resist scammers. They did find that compared to a control group, 2 weeks later when there was a pretend scammer calling them up, they were more resistant. Unfortunately, 6 months later, they weren't. So there was no longer a difference between these groups. So we clearly have to keep educating people. We have to educate the families and the communities in addition. But we also have to try, as all these people are doing, to stop the frauds before they get there. Because many of these people just do not know how to resist it. And I think that, one of the issues that we've had is that it's not only that people, when they have diminished capacity, the first thing that tends to go is their ability to handle their financial affairs. At least people with sort of pre-Alzheimer's disease. There also seems to be something, and there hasn't been much research on this, about being more trusting. But it's hard because there's some people that seem very resistant to this. I was just reading the Washington Post yesterday, and I think John Kelly said this best. He's talking about a green dot scam, but green does not mean go for it. And he starts out, he does the usual, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. I've been doing that for 30 years. Doesn't always work. It says when a stranger calls to say you've won something, you haven't. tamp down that little flutter of excitement, listen to the voice that says, why would somebody call you out of the blue to tell you you've won a sweepstakes you didn't even remember entering? Sadly, enough people listen to the other voice, the one that says, why shouldn't dumb luck smile upon me once in a while? Do I not deserve the universe's love? And the scammers make a decent living. So we have a real issue in terms of trying to prevent it other than through the great work of law enforcement.
Yeah, and that raises the question, is why would it be, and I'll give this to you, Naomi, why would it be that older folks may say, why doesn't dumb luck shine on me? Something about them, perhaps, that you've looked into, especially talking about some of the research that you've done. Why would older folks think that, perhaps more so than us?
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here. I guess I want to talk a little bit generally about that question about why are older people targeted and why are they particularly vulnerable, and then zero in a little bit more on what Betsy mentioned about diminished capacity and the research that we've done. So the research really shows there are quite a number of reasons that older people are targets of fraud and financial exploitation. They include, this is pretty basic. They're the people who hold the largest portion of the wealth in our country. So even though individually many of them may be poor, that's where the money is and that's where the scammers go. It may be that they are more trusting and that they are more unsophisticated about financial matters. There's often a presumption that they are more vulnerable and thus they're targeted because they're perceived as being more vulnerable. And they may in fact be more vulnerable due to cognitive impairments that I'll go into in a second. Also, many older people are more isolated, and thus they are more dependent on helpers of a whole variety, and those helpers have great access to their money and to their documents. So, these are crimes of opportunity. So just to zero in for a minute on diminished capacity, because I think with the age boom and with people living longer, more and more people are having cognitive impairments and diminished ability to make decisions, including financial decisions, and we have family members, the financial services industry, all kinds of industries and professions saying, oh my God, we have this coming, we don't really understand it, and what are we going to do about it? So capacity, decision-making capacity is really not an all or nothing thing. It's made up of a number of types of capacity. We have capacity to make personal decisions about your everyday life, capacity to make healthcare decisions, and then capacity to make decisions about financial transactions. And what we've learned, as Betsy said, is that financial capacity, it's been called the canary in the coal mine of capacity. It's really the first to go. And it's made up of a number of skills. It includes your basic monetary abilities, identifying and counting money, understanding debt and loans, conducting cash transactions, paying bills, and then I want to underline this last one because this neuropsychologists have done research and identified this one component of financial capacity is maintaining judgment to act prudently and avoid financial exploitation. So you can see when financial capacity starts to go, people become more vulnerable. And the population numbers, not to throw a lot of numbers at you, but they're pretty astounding. Declining financial skills start to happen when people have mild cognitive impairment, not even full-blown Alzheimer's disease. 22% of Americans aged 71 and older have mild cognitive impairment. So that's a lot of people. 1 out of 8 people 65 and older has full-blown Alzheimer's disease. So we can see where this is going. So let's just bring it closer to home with an example. Dad seems fine. He's still handling his bank account, his brokerage accounts, and then the bank teller sees him perhaps making sudden and uncharacteristic large withdrawals or having multiple overdrafts, or the broker is getting calls to cash in his conservative investments and to buy shares in a risky startup that he just heard about from his new best friend. So we all know, and many of us have had personal experience, that it's really hard to take away the car keys when dad's reflexes are getting slow or his vision declines. But one day we fear that dad's car will hit a child crossing the street, and so we do something about it. Similarly, we don't want to take away mom's financial driver's license. And then we see mom being taken by a lottery scheme, buying an inappropriate annuity after attending a free lunch seminar, or getting ripped off by her home care aide. So you can see that we have a huge challenge. I'll just talk really quickly about the research at ARP Public Policy Institute that Betsy talked about. It was in the investor sphere, but we surveyed frontline financial advisors, broker-dealers, and also their compliance officers about, do they understand diminished capacity? Do they see it as a problem? Do they have protocols in their firms to deal with it? Are they worried about financial exploitation? What do they need? And the message was loud and clear. Yes, they see it as a problem. Almost all of them recognized it. Some of them had protocols, but their protocols were all over the map. They overwhelmingly say, we need training on diminished capacity. It should be mandatory, but our firms don't require it. So I think it's interesting that there's a recognition, but yet we don't have the tools yet, and we're going to all have to start working together to create them.
And one of the scams you mentioned, Naomi, was the lottery scams. Jeff Steger, who's actually in my office, has done some work in lottery scams, as have others. Can you talk a little bit about what a lottery scam is, with the focus on how the scammers use some of the vulnerabilities that both Betsy and Naomi talked about with older folks, how they use that to their advantage to steal money?
Sure. Yeah. As a prosecutor with the Consumer Protection Branch, we're currently participating in a number of investigations involving lottery scams that are emanating from Jamaica and preying on citizens in the U.S., mainly elderly people. Essentially, the scammers will call potential victims in the U.S., including many elderly people, and inform the potential victims that they have won cash and prizes, sometimes cash and a Mercedes, typically a car, but mostly money. We're talking about millions of dollars that these people are told they won, and indicate that the winnings will only be delivered once the individuals pay upfront fees, taxes, or insurance. Victims end up sending the money through wire transfer, through entities that David had mentioned earlier, through Western Union, through MoneyGram, through stored value cards, the Green Dot card that Betsy mentioned, and that money ultimately will be sent down to Jamaica. Our office is currently in the middle, as I mentioned, involved in a number of investigations, and I just want to give a profiles of 5 recent victims that we have talked to, meaning within the last couple weeks. And I'm going to be very generic because these are obviously ongoing criminal investigations. One is a female, early 70s. She was working at the time. She was living alone. Received a call that she had won a sweepstakes prize of $3 to $5 million. During the conversation, the initial conversation, the fraudster was most interested in knowing from her what it felt like to win the lottery, and that was essentially to gain her trust. Over time, they had many conversations, many emails. He was able to get her trust, and she ended up sending tens of thousands of dollars and wiring tens of thousands of dollars, which ultimately, we believe, ended up in Jamaica. A second victim, a female in her late 80s, living at home alone in a small town. She acknowledged that she entered sweepstakes at times. She was called at least 12 times in a 2.5-week period, and she ended up wiring money to them. A third victim, a male in his late 70s, early 80s. He was a widower, lived alone in a small town. He was an owner of a small business during his career, and he was a victim of this type of lottery scam. A fourth victim, a female in her 70s, lived in a small town, lived alone. acknowledged that she entered sweepstakes such as Publishers Clearinghouse, and she was victimized by multiple groups over a period of several months, and she wired money to them. She got suspicious after she didn't get her winnings, but they offered her an excuse saying that because her fees were not coming in as quickly as they had anticipated, that her winnings were being delayed, and that's how she continued to got caught up in this scam. And finally, a fifth victim, a female in her early 70s, again lived in a small town. They sent her a check to purportedly pay the fees, that this was going to be in advance. She deposited the check, and she immediately or shortly thereafter withdrew the money from the check and sent it out. The check bounced, and so she was out that money. To put a little bit more meat on this profile, these people that we've been talking to most recently, they are elderly, but they're not in their 90s. They're not in nursing homes. They're typically people who are living alone. They're independent. They have some disposable income, but not a huge amount. So after a couple weeks, when their disposable income is gone, it's not unusual that they would take out a loan on their house, or typically they would take a cash advance on credit cards. To talk about their profile a little bit more, the scammers, who at least in these investigations are from Jamaica, they will call these individuals more than perhaps their family members will call them.
Jeff, let me stop there, because I think that goes right to something that we were going to ask Jonathan about, which is what's striking about, or what's common to me about all these individuals, is that they were living alone, and that perhaps part of what the draw is to these folks is they have somebody to talk to, and that goes to something called imposter frauds that I know you may have heard of. There's different flavors of it, so to speak. But Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about imposter frauds, what they are, and also talk a little bit about your work internationally, because as Jeff said, all this money is being wired internationally, and it sounds like perhaps there are frauds around the world that are similar to ours that can inform what we do.
Thanks, Mike. Let me talk first about imposter frauds, and then, as Mike suggested, talk about some of the broader ramifications of the types of mass marketing fraud that Mike and Jeff's office, our section, and several U.S. attorneys' offices, as well as our federal investigative agency partners, have been working on. Imposter frauds can fall into a couple of different categories. One of them, which has gotten a lot of currency lately among hardcore fraudsters, is known very simply as the grandparent scam. We first heard about this several years ago in Japan, and the MO for this is fundamentally the same as we now hear about today in the United States. People get lists of others, typically senior citizens, although they may be calling these people cold, and when the phone rings and that person picks up at the other end of the phone, the person says, "It's me." And depending on whether they know that they're calling an older person, obviously it won't work in every single instance, but oftentimes the person will say, if it happens, let's say, to someone in the United States, "Johnny, is that you?" And that's all they need. They'll say, "Yes, Grandma, it's me. I'm so glad I got you. I've been arrested. I'm here in fill in the country. I'm here in France. I'm here in the Netherlands. I need bail money. Can you possibly wire me some bail money?" Or, "I've been in an accident. I need money. I have to pay the hospital. Can you just send some money to me right away?" Now, Naomi and Beth both touched on the issue of different kinds of vulnerabilities that may stem more from neurobiology. These are the types of scams that you can understand would readily play on the heartstrings of anybody who simply makes a mistake and never anticipates the possibility that someone would be calling them up with the specific purpose of lying from the very first words of the conversation to get money from them. So, they respond in the way they think they need to help out their loved one, grandson, whoever, and only later on do they find out the $1,000 or $1,500 they just wired somewhere didn't go to their grandson,
it went in the pockets of fraudsters. And as for other types of imposter scams, the grandparent scam is sort of a variation on things we've seen increasingly, not just in the United States, but from other venues around the world. About 10 days ago, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police made arrests in the Montreal area of several individuals who engaged full-time in the grandparent scam, specifically targeting older Americans. Now, why is it that they would be doing this? Well, first of all, for a long time, U.S. law enforcement has recognized that there's been, say often a two-way trade, you might say, in fraud between the U.S. and Canada. Going back as far as 1998, a series of regional task forces were set up across Canada with U.S. and Canadian participation to work telemarketing fraud and other types of mass marketing fraud on a collective basis. And all of our major partners in consumer fraud, ranging from the Federal Trade Commission to the FBI, the Postal Inspection Service, the Secret Service, have all participated in different ways in these types of task forces. Well, the frame of reference has changed. Now, when Jeff talks about lottery fraud, no, he didn't say, as we might have a number of years back, South Florida or Southern California. Now it's Costa Rica, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, and farther afield, Spain, and other parts of the world. Now, in part because we have seen, and Assistant Attorney General Brewer's remarks highlighted this as well, as we have seen the globalization of crime in general, we've seen the globalization of fraud, including the globalization of techniques. When we first started to compare notes with our law enforcement colleagues, going back probably 4 or 5 years ago, in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and even Nigeria, we started to find that we were talking about the same kinds of scams, with the same kinds of techniques, targeted against the same kinds, in many instances, of senior populations, often as well, by the same groups of people. So part of what we've sought to do, and I think it's fair to say that Mike's office, fraud section, and multiple U.S. attorneys have focused on this particularly. What we're trying to do is take our ability to respond to these types of frauds directed at older Americans to the next level, where we share information with each other about who, from our respective investigations and intelligence, we figured out are the main players behind these schemes. Where are they launching these schemes from? Where are they getting their lead lists from? How are they recruiting? How do they organize? Where are they moving their money? More and more, what we focus on within the Justice Department and the rest of the federal law enforcement community has to do with sharing information better, faster, coordinating more effectively, as I think the Department and the FTC, for example, have done very successfully over a number of years, but recognizing that fraud has become globalized, and particularly when you're talking about targeting of seniors with so many different types of scams, whether it's lottery scams, inheritance scams, grandparent scams, ultimately, we have to move faster, share information faster, and collaborate faster. That RCMP arrest that I mentioned is one example of what we can do, but it takes that kind of active and sustained cooperation between law enforcement here and in other countries.
And that's coordination among law enforcement. There's also the international component of these will affect the kind of messages we will send to consumers. And that's something I think David would like to talk about how the FTC is recognizing the international component of much of their work and how it affects the messaging or the messages that they give out to the consumers, to consumers generally.
You know, let me put this in context. I think this has been a terrific summary of the kinds of scams that are plaguing older people in the United States, but they pose a real problem, a real challenge both for law enforcement and for consumer education. So let me just sort of run through some of the reasons why that is so. These are retail rather than wholesale scams. One of the keys to the scam typically is getting someone on the phone and having a conversation with them. They may be initiated through the internet, they may be initiated through the receipt of a fake check, but generally there is one-on-one interaction between the scammer and the victim. Second, as Jonathan has pointed out, a lot of these boiler rooms are not in the United States. If they're in Canada, they're in Jamaica, they're in Ghana. We get these complaints. Now even Peru and Spain show up on our list in terms of where these kinds of calls originate from. So these are not the boiler rooms in Tampa that we can shut down easily. Third, there are multiplicity of scams. If you want to just educate people about grandparent scams, that's one thing. But these scams take multiple forms. They're grandparent scams, they're lottery scams, they're sweepstakes scams, they're fake check scams, they're mystery shopper scams. As you multiply the forms the scam takes, you geometrically increase the difficulties of doing consumer ads. We really have a three-pronged approach to going after these scams at the FTC. First and foremost, of course, we want to stop these scams. We want to close down the boiler rooms. We work very closely with the Canadian authorities, the Jamaican authorities, and others to try to find these guys and to stop them. We also are trying to go after what we think is the pivot point here. At some point, the elderly person needs to send money to the scam artist. And that is the point where we can go after them wholesale, not retail. So we have MoneyGram, which is the second largest money transfer company, under order. We have Western Union agreeing to abide by essentially the terms we have in our MoneyGram order. One of the things that we have done and is starting to really yield results is we've insisted on really clear consumer ads. So if you walk into many Walmarts today, hopefully within a year, if you walk into any Walmart, MoneyGram's principal outlets are in Walmart stores. They are under our order. You will see facing you as a consumer a Miranda warning. If you think you've won a lottery, guess again. If you're sending money to a relative, call them and make sure. If you think that check that you've just cashed is a real check, wait a month because it probably isn't. If you've been hired as a mystery shopper, again, sorry, you're out of luck. And they're training the personnel who actually man the desk there to talk to an elderly person who's about to wire money to Jamaica or Montreal or Ghana. Why are you sending this money? And one of the sad parts of this, and this gets to what, to Naomi and Beth were talking about before, is sometimes they have to fight with the person. You didn't win. Oh, but it says right here, I've won $1 million. And there are tragic stories in which ultimately they leave the MoneyGram outlet, which won't let them wire the money, and go somewhere else and send it. Which sort of underscores the difficulty of succeeding on the consumer ed front.
Jeff, you wanted to mention something?
Well, just to echo what David was saying, commonly in these types of scams, and I believe David will know this, in order to assure the victim that they have won, they may very well receive documents on FTC letterhead, on DOJ letterhead, on IRS letterhead, on Federal Reserve letterhead, saying that they've won the lottery or saying that this amount. And one of the tactics that the government can use is that there are laws against impersonating a federal employee or using this type of stuff.
Yeah, let me just finish. So one of the things we're doing is not only going after the wire transfer companies, but for example, Green Dot has agreed not to allow basically refunds, getting money in Jamaica. We're working now with the store value card companies in order to try to combat this fraud, because as important as stopping them, going after the scammers is, as important as consumer ed is, the way I think we'll ultimately get real traction here is by going after the money and stopping and interdicting the flow of the money.
And and that's an important sort of conceptual law enforcement tactic that a lot of us are using, which is what we've sometimes been calling a choke point. Where can we attack a legitimate business to stop the flow of money? We've been talking a little bit about some what seem to be sophisticated frauds overseas using phones and wires, but the tried and true door-to-door fraud still exists. I mean, tin men are still around. They are not selling aluminum siding anymore, and it's something that Abby Kuzma and the Attorney General's office in Indiana have been doing a lot of. So if you could talk a little bit about the door-to-door fraud that still happens.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's still very common. We at the Indiana Attorney General's office have seen all of these scams among the consumers that we are representing. One of the scams that's very common in our area, partly because every year we face a lot of storms, which you've all been reading about in southern Indiana and Tennessee and Illinois. We always get tornadoes. We always get very severe storms with hail, et cetera. There are a group of scammers that will go from door to door and from state to state following the storms. We typically call them storm chasers. Sometimes we have a different group of scammers that we call travelers that just come seasonally, depending upon what the issues are. But in the case of the storm chasers, what will happen is they will follow a disaster, and they will go door to door and say things like, I just repaired your neighbor's roof, and I have some materials left over. Be happy to give you a discount on your repair for your house because I got, one more day that I'm going to be here. If you can decide right now. So there's always this high-pressure sales, the concern for, you're going to make a deal only right now. We did it for your neighbor. So they're trying to, give a number of areas of comfort with respect to, I've already been in your neighborhood, et cetera. And of course, we've even seen people get up on the roofs and make damage so that they can, ostensibly repair it. A lot of times the insurance company gets involved where they talk the person into signing over their ability to take the money, et cetera. So it's a very pervasive thing. We see it every single year and seasonally as well. And it's a really big problem. We also see many of the things that you all have been talking about in terms of persons helpers coming into people's homes and taking advantage of elderly persons.
And I think that's one, if you could expand on that, because I'm going to go next to, we've been talking a lot about strangers calling up, and it sounds like you're talking about that folks who know
these are the opposite of strangers. It can be a family member, as we've been discussing, but it can also just be someone who takes advantage of the situation of being in the home of the individual. We've also seen persons who are committing identity theft, and this is something we warn people about all the time, where you've got a repair individual who's come into the home to fix the toilet or fix something in the home. And especially elderly people, but really any of us, don't think about what kinds of personal information might be lying around in the house while that individual is wandering around effecting the repair. So it's very important. One of the things we educate people about is before you have some stranger into your home, be sure to walk around your home, especially where they might be, and cover up everything. Make sure that anything that is that has your personal identification information is taken and put away someplace safe. We find that, and I really appreciated all the research that AARP has done, because we find education one-on-one to be much more effective with elderly than anything else. So what we do is we go all around the state, and I would encourage FTC and all of the federal partners to use the state AG's offices. A lot of us do have very extensive outreach departments where we go around the state and specifically educate groups of elderly and other vulnerable populations. They listen to us because they think of us as being, we have a certain amount of authority for them because we're the AG's office in their state. They see us as good guys. So we have a bit of trust there. And frankly, it's just harder to reach people with paper. And this is a group of population where, you all have awesome materials on the internet, but they don't use the internet. And they don't look on the internet for information. They don't even know they need the information until you tell them that this is what's going on. So, and we do it annually, or if not more often.
I think in the interest of time we have to...
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. We should wrap up, and I think I just leave with one question, which is a natural outgrowth of what you're saying, and I'll direct it to David, which is some folks don't know to ask or don't know what's out there, and one of the things I'd like you to comment on very briefly is how do law enforcement learn about frauds? How can folks be more willing to report them, and then how can we turn around and tell people about things that are happening?
We depend, like every other law enforcement agency, on the courage of people to step forward. And so one of the things that we've been doing is we've been doing common ground conferences. We've been going all over the country, meeting with consumer groups, legal services, local law enforcement to try to encourage people to reach out. That effort has yielded enormous dividends because we are getting people who are in the nursing homes or do reach out to provide services to the elderly.
I think that's we'll stop on that because I think that's a really fascinating point. As opposed to waiting for people to come to us, and the people in the room here, I suppose, can take that as a last message. You can reach out to where folks are.
Get out of D.C.
Well, thank you, folks. Thanks for the information.
Good work. Now, we're going to want to get a quarter of us, I guess, for your complaint data comes in debt collection.
All right, well, thank you, Mike, and to the rest of the panelists there. As you're leaving the stage, I will. I'd like to let everybody know on a registration table out front, there are lots of different pamphlets and sheets of paper and other information that's been made available by many different public consumer protection groups, as well as by federal law enforcement agencies, FTC, and IRS has put some information out. SIGTARP put something out about mortgage modification scams. So if you have not already taken an opportunity to look through those documents and the information that's made available, please do so before you leave here today. The next panel is going to be a discussion of common tax scams. This is a timely subject, as you know. Tax day is approaching. And the panelists are, to my immediate left, Sally Cooper, the Director of Operations from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation, and to her left is Carol Ide, the Civil Criminal Coordinator in the Tax Division of the Department of Justice. And they're going to talk about, again, common tax scams that consumers and individuals should watch out for as they're preparing to file their tax returns. So, Sally, Carol, thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the panel this afternoon. As Mike said, I'm Sally Cooper. I'm the Acting Director of Operations, Policy, and Support for IRS Criminal Investigation. And one thing we were talking about as we were listening to all the panels is that there is a permeation of scams or commonalities between the scams in every panel that it seems to be presenting today. As far as criminal investigations mission, CI is the investigative arm of the Internal Revenue Service. We support the overall mission of IRS, but we enforce the criminal statutes relative to tax administration and related financial crimes in order to encourage and achieve voluntary compliance with the Internal Revenue Code. Once the investigation is complete, we forward a recommendation for prosecution to our partners at the Department of Justice. Specifically, we start with the Tax Division, who reviews our work and hopefully authorizes for us to go forward with prosecution. And they then, in turn, refer it over to the respective U.S. Attorney's Office. And Carol was going to give a little bit about her mission.
The Tax Division at the Justice Department does review all criminal referrals from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigative Division. Our attorneys do a lot of the prosecutions, but we really rely on the local United States attorneys to carry the bulk of that water in the criminal prosecution. We also have a civil arm, actually more civil attorneys, because, as you know, there's a lot of affirmative tax litigation, which actually may be seen as kind of anti-consumer. I've been doing foreclosures for over 23 years, so there are a number of people who probably don't like a big part of our mission. But we also combat, on the civil side, a lot of the kind of scams that we'll be talking about today, that Sally will be talking about today. For example, getting injunctions against bad tax return preparers and abusive tax shelter promoters, things like that. So we're working and in accordance with the Attorney General's recent memorandum, really pushing parallel investigations and parallel proceedings where we civilly shut down a scam, collect as much delinquent tax and penalties as possible, but also investigate and prosecute criminally wherever possible. So we're really pushing those parallel proceedings.
Each year, IRS has been putting out what we call the Dirty Dozen. And what that is a list of 12, of the top 12 scams that are perpetrated against innocent taxpayers. I'm just going to cover a few of them today, but topping the list this year is identity theft. And again, you've heard that mentioned through several presentations. And it is becoming so critical to protect your personal information. As was just mentioned on the previous panel, even having someone in your home, you have to be careful of what you have laying around. The IRS is taking a very proactive look at identity theft. We're sending notices to taxpayers, which is sometimes their first notice that their identity has been compromised when we see more than one return being filed, and or we see that a W-2 has been filed in that person's name that it has an unknown employer. In January, the IRS announced where we did a coordinated sweep trying to attack this identity theft issue. Now, anyone that believes that their identity has been compromised, there is an IRS identity protection specialized unit, and that information can be accessed on irs.gov and look for identity theft. Mr. Barat out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, he mentioned identity theft, and he also mentioned phishing as well. And phishing is where someone uses email or some other electronic media to try and solicit someone to respond, either giving personal identification, giving account information. And for IRS, it can appear that it is coming from either a legitimate IRS inquiry or some related entity. IRS will generally not send an initial solicitation or request for personal information to a taxpayer. So that should be a warning sign right away. If you get an email from someone that it appears that it's IRS or it appears that it's related to IRS, be concerned and don't respond. Either call IRS, go to the irs.gov and look for steps to take. But that's one way that once they get your information, again, they can use that for all types of scams. They can use it to file false tax returns. They can use it to obtain mortgage loans. They can use it for all types of things, and it's very hard to correct once that happens.
Let me just add, with the phishing, the attempts to get personal information from consumers, and then what happens is generally these scammers turn around and file some sort of false refund claim. And often, as Sally mentioned, the first notification a victim will have that somebody else has stolen their identity, has gotten their personal information, and has filed a bogus refund claim is when they go to file their own tax return and it gets bounced because the IRS has already received what appears to be a legitimate tax return under that individual's Social Security number. These scammers file tax returns very, very early in the tax season. In fact, most of them are on vacation by now. And if you're like me, you're just thinking about, oh yeah, pretty soon I think I need to file my tax return. So, the legitimate folks tend to get really surprised by this late date. We prosecute at Justice. The IRS has been referring a lot of these refund crimes that are facilitated through identity theft to the Justice Department. And we participated in the January push that Sally mentioned. We have even since November, when our Deputy Assistant Attorney General testified before our House Committee, since November we've had a ton of very, very strong sentences for refund crimes that include an aggravated identity theft count. And a lot of these were able to get, as part of sentencing, a restitution component. So it's restitution, hopefully, to victims. And sometimes they are not everybody that is involved in a refund crime is necessarily a victim, but there's restitution for innocent victims as well as to the U.S. Treasury. Collecting that's another story, but the courts have been pretty receptive to giving restitution to both categories of victims, both the individuals and the United States.
Thanks, Carol. And you made a good point that all taxpayers who are subject to a scam may or may not be victims. In the first two, the phishing and the ID theft, probably they're more victims than part of the scheme. But when you're talking about questionable return preparers, and you go to a return preparer and you give them your information, you're ultimately still responsible for what's on that return. And so in 2012, every paid return preparer needs to have a preparer tax identification number. And when they sign that return, they need to enter that return or that number on the return. And let me just say, we're focused here today on consumer fraud, but most of the return preparers out there are honest and decent. We're focusing, though, on those ones that are taking advantage of individuals. And some of the things that we need to watch out for, or consumers need to watch out for when they are choosing a return preparer is, one, does the return preparer sign the return and enter their preparer tax identification number? Do they give you a copy of the return? Because you should always see what has been filed with IRS before it is filed, and you should get a copy to sign. Are they promising you a larger refund than you thought you would get? And it goes back to the old adage, and somebody mentioned it earlier, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Do they base your refund, their fee, on a percentage of your refund? That's also a clue, because that probably means they're inflating your refund in order to increase their fee. Do they require you to split the refund with them? And do not ever sign a blank return and then let them fill it in and then mail it in. Because again, remember, if you're going to a return preparer to have your return prepared, you're ultimately responsible for what's on that return. And this too comes into, Carol mentioned some injunction earlier, and that's one of the mechanisms that are used against fraudulent return preparers.
Right. One of the things we all have to keep in mind is that something like 60% of U.S. taxpayers use a paid return preparer. And as Sally mentioned, most of them are good. They've gone through continuing education programs. They have their preparer tax ID number, and they do a decent job. But it is the ones that are perpetuating fraud and taking advantage of consumers that are the real problem. And we can deal with that in the federal government two ways. Number one is prosecuting them, because it is a crime to file a false return. It's a crime to assist people in filing a false statement with the United States. But the other thing we do, and can often do much more quickly, is get a civil injunction against a bad return preparer to stop them from preparing bad returns. That can frequently be done much more quickly than a criminal prosecution. Typically what we will do is we'll get a referral from the Internal Revenue Service on a bad return preparer. We will talk to several clients, maybe people that have worked with the return preparer, get a preliminary injunction, issue a press release right away, and then the community knows we have a bad return preparer, or at least a potentially bad return preparer in the community, and then seek a permanent injunction. A number of these bad return preparers very quickly say, we give up, we will stop preparing returns, and we get a lot of these injunctions by consent. In fact, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles is doing a fabulous job getting consent injunctions from bad tax return preparers, often as part of a plea agreement in a criminal prosecution. So they are sort of killing two birds with one stone. And what you do with that is you have an incredible deterrent effect. You clean your area out of bad return preparers. And that really is the power of both the criminal and the civil injunctions. One of the typical provisions in a civil injunction against a tax return preparer is that the return preparer notify all their clients that they have been prohibited from preparing returns and that perhaps tax returns they did prepare were false or fraudulent, and also provide the Internal Revenue Service with a list of all the clients for whom they prepared bad returns. Now, what that means frequently is that the Internal Revenue Service will then go out and find the clients and try to make up the tax loss from the individual clients. A lot of them are very upset by that, but remember the goal is to collect the right amount of tax from everyone, and a lot of these people are either victims of a bad return preparer or, as Sally mentioned, a lot of them actually participate in the filing of a bogus return through a bad return preparer. So it is kind of a delicate balance there, but we do try to collect the right amount of tax through the civil and the criminal proceedings.
And the last one I'll touch on today is what we term free money, where people put up flyers and they advertise that, hey, come in to us and you can get free money from IRS. And this typically targets some of the lower income individuals and the elderly, as we just heard about. They charge people for filing their returns, and sometimes the returns don't go through, but they already have their fees and they're gone with that money. And we have a number of tools in criminal investigation that we use to go out and A, identify these taxpayers, B, to do investigations, and our goal is to enforce those laws and ultimately put people in jail that are committing this fraud against the taxpayers and the government to deter that from happening in the future. But just like we're meeting here today and people have been working all day, one of the best preventive measurements is awareness, so that we do outreach and we go and we talk to people so that they are aware that these scams are going on, and hopefully when someone approaches them with something that does appear too good to be true, they think twice about it before they commit or turn over money or turn over their identifying information. Even when you're going out to do your own personal health care or other items, a lot of times a form will ask you for your Social Security number and other identifying things. And I've found that because generally my husband is the primary and I never have it, they never come back and ask me for it. They are always able to process it without that information. So as much as we can get out, as little information that you put out in a public venue, the better, because any personal information that gets out is vulnerable for someone of a bad purpose to get it and use it for misdeeds, whether it's filing a tax return or some of the other scams that you've heard about. Ultimately, they're all to make money for somebody who's getting it that it doesn't belong to. As far as IRS, if you have any questions or any doubts of any information that you receive, especially that is unsolicited, please go to the www.irs.gov website, and they have all the official information that has been put out and that would be used by IRS for official business.
And also just a little reminder, on the table outside, Sally has put down the press release of this year's Dirty Dozen. So if you want a little light reading, you can read about all the other scams that we deal with if you can't get access to the internet right this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally and Carol. That was terrific and certainly timely advice. This is just to show you all. This is the copy of the IRS news release that's out front on the Dirty Dozen tax scams. As I was sitting there thinking about it, the Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force has its own website. It's www.stopfraud.gov. I think what I'd like to do, if possible, is make sure that this IRS tax scam news release is uploaded to that website and made available to as many people as possible. Our next panel is on business opportunity fraud schemes. Its moderator is Charles Harwood. He's the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection with the Federal Trade Commission. The panelists are Lois Greisman, the Associate Director in the Division of Marketing Practices at FTC, Andre Barat, who you heard from earlier, the United States Attorney for the Central District of California, Richard Goldberg is the Assistant Director of the Consumer Branch in the Civil Division of the Department of Justice, Ed Mierzinski, the Consumer Program Director with the United States Public Interest Research Group, also known as PIRG, and Peggy Shanks is a Senior Examiner at the Office of the Maryland Attorney General. So with that, I turn it over to Chuck.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks, Mike. So I'll let my panelists take their seats here, and I'll just begin with an observation. Who among us hasn't at one time or another thought, gee, wouldn't it be great if I could go out and start my own job? Maybe it was only a fleeting thought, but I suspect if we took a poll of consumers, we'd find that many of them think they have within them someplace the ability to make it on their own, to start their own business. Maybe they won't start the next banks, but at the very least they're going to go out and do something that will make them a little extra money. In many instances, it stops right there. Consumers think it'd be nice if I had my own business, but they pretty much stop at that point. In times of financial anxiety, when people are feeling anxious, feeling uncertain, I suspect at times, for example, when people are thinking that their job is at stake, they think they need a little extra income because they aren't getting the hours they used to be getting, they're thinking they're facing extra education costs because they've got kids in college, they're worried about medical bills they may be facing, or they're realizing, for example, that their retirement just doesn't go quite as far as they thought it would. But for whatever reason, they're feeling financial anxiety. And frankly, that's the kind of situation many consumers find themselves in right now. And when they find themselves in that situation, I think it makes them more likely to decide to take that next step, to go out and actually try to make money on their own, to sign up for a business opportunity, or to try to find a work-at-home scheme. And when they go out in the marketplace and begin to look around, what they find is, guess what? There are many, many companies and individuals who are happy to help them start that business opportunity program, or start that business opportunity, or start that work-at-home program. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about here today, business opportunities and work-at-home. And the problem, as we're going to see in just a minute, is that while there are many legitimate opportunities out there, there are also many, many instances where consumers end up being scammed and find themselves worse off than they were before. So we have some eminent panelists here today who are going to talk to us about this. And I'm going to start with Lois Greisman, who's with the Federal Trade Commission. And Lois, do you want to talk briefly about what we're seeing with regard to business opportunity fraud schemes?
Sure.
Thank you,
Chuck. It's a real problem, and it's a problem that's not going away, as Chuck highlighted, as others have highlighted. With the economic downturn, people are unemployed, they're underemployed. For various reasons, they need to supplement their income. I want to just take a moment and say, what is a business opportunity, or as we do shorthand, BizOp? It's just a commercial arrangement. I will help set you up in business. You'll pay me to help you set up, and I'll provide you something that may or may not be real. Perhaps it's assistance securing an outlet, setting up a place, location assistance, or maybe I'll be willing to buy back your merchandise, which often is the touchstone of a work-at-home scheme, where you'll sit at home stuffing envelopes or building various pieces of craft, and I'll buy them back and I'll find a market for you. Consistently a top complaint getter in the complaints the FTC receives over the course of the year. Last year, FTC received 1.8 million complaints. Business opportunities were in the top 20.
Thank you, Lois. And next to Lois is Rich Goldberg with the Department of Justice. Rich, I know you've done a lot of work in this area involved in concerning prosecution. Why don't you talk about one of the schemes you've seen and worked on, and talk about how you did the investigation and what you found?
Sure. Typically, the business opportunity firms that we investigate involve the sale of vending machines, coffee machines, internet kiosks, DVD kiosks, any kind of self-contained unit that can be placed in a retail outlet, and the locations are promised by the business opportunity firm as well. These are supposed to be high-traffic, high-profit locations where the buyer of the machine is going to earn a large profit. So frequently these salespeople use earnings claims. They'll tell prospective buyers that they'll make their money back within a year or so. They'll send them to references who claim falsely that they own a successful opportunity with these vending machines. Frequently they are the cousins or brothers or other salespeople who are posing as real customers, but in reality they're getting paid to lie to prospective buyers. The customers will also be referred to locators who will promise these high traffic, high profit locations when in fact they are just part of the conspiracy. Now, one of the scams that some of our attorneys in the office have uncovered is a particularly nefarious kind of this scam. They did it in conjunction with the Postal Inspection Service. And this was a scam that appeared to be out of the U.S., various different cities where these scam artists purported to be in the U.S. They purported to sell coffee machines or greeting card display racks from the U.S., but in reality they were in Costa Rica. All signs from the prospective buyers indicated that they were in fact in these cities in the U.S. They used voice over IP to make it seem like they were using real phone numbers in the U.S. They were using drop boxes in the U.S. and other mechanisms to disguise the fact that they, the salespeople, the locators, and the references were actually all sitting in a boiler room in San Jose, Costa Rica. And so they had various phones in the boiler room that indicated the phone numbers, the U.S. phone numbers that they were purportedly from. They had scripts saying, "Hi, I'm John Doe, and I'm a successful buyer of this business opportunity," so that the telemarketer sitting in San Jose knew what to say to the prospective buyers. Working closely with the Costa Rican government, we were able to execute search warrants, or Costa Rica was able to execute search warrants on the business opportunity rooms in San Jose. They were also able to do a number of arrests and extradite these folks back to the United States for prosecution, and they've received very high sentences as a result of the prosecution. These typically, the scams that we've prosecuted have been ones where it's not true that these consumers should have been aware that they were being scammed. This isn't the circumstance of, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Because these consumers are doing their due diligence. They're calling references. They're calling locators. They're looking at the Better Business Bureau, their website, to see are these businesses highly rated. But the problem is these scams will open up under one name, they'll run for 9 or 10 months, and then they'll close down and resurface under a completely different name and location. So there's no way that the consumers could know, there's no way that the Better Business Bureau would know that this is actually a fraud that's been going on for years. So while in some contexts that advice is good for consumers in the business opportunity industry, they won't know. They need to just be very aware. They need to look at the advice that the Federal Trade Commission gives, because otherwise they're going to fall for this scam.
Thank you, Rich. Sitting next to Rich is Peggy Shanks, who's with the Attorney General's Office in the state of Maryland. And Peggy, do you want to talk about what you've seen from the state of Maryland in terms of these business opportunities?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to say that anything that I say may not necessarily be the opinion of the Maryland Attorney General, the Maryland Securities Commissioner, and are based on my own knowledge, education, information, and beliefs. Having said that, today many of the scammers rely on technology, the internet, and websites, and upselling. But I can assure you that telemarketing and these cold calls are alive and well. Recently, we got 4 such cases. One of them involves an elderly woman. I'm going to describe that case a little bit, but it's pretty much atypical. Caller A calls her and tells her she has a business opportunity. It's a great investment, where she would purchase an internet website for an online mall where she would sell travel packages, and she's going to earn some commissions. And piqued her interest, so a little while later, caller B calls her, says he's going to be her account manager, he's going to help her set it up. If you buy 3 levels of packages, you can earn $9,600 with just one sale. So he also told her she's going to get these travel binders. It's going to have all these discount coupons and vouchers and things. It's going to help her for her business. So she buys her virtual office and gives them $300. On the same day after that, though, B says, well, you might need some national advertising because you're probably going to need to increase your sales and get people interested. She gives them her credit card number and pays another $1,500.
A day later, he calls her back and says, you know you could earn $1,000 from the sale as a level 1 director package. She pays an additional $2,000. 2 weeks later, B calls her to upgrade to a level 2 director package. This time she's going to get leads and auto blasts, and she's going to get 6,500 targeted visitors to her website. She was a little concerned because she had a credit card with a really high interest rate, but she put $4,000 on that credit card. 2 weeks later, C calls her. Says, I think you should upgrade to a level 3 director package. Now the elderly lady says, I'm sorry, all I have left is savings fund for my daughter's college education. They said, you're going to make so much, you're going to pay for your daughter's college education with the money you're going to earn. She writes a check for another $7,900. 2 months later, D calls her, and while they're at it, I guess they thought she still had some money. So for additional $600, she could get an autoresponder that would help promote that website. Months passed, and CG trying to get these voucher binders, and she never receives any. She invested $18,300 and made zero money. In our state, the commissioner does not have the authority to order money paid back. But even if so, there was no money. This Arizona company after that filed bankruptcy. Now, CG thinks as a creditor, she's going to get her money back. We all know that's not true. Anyway, Maryland has issued a show cause order, and they have not responded to it, so I can't tell you the outcome of it. Excuse me, but in the order, it alleges violation of the Act, fraud, and other misrepresentations, and we're seeking for a permanent bar against the company and the president from offering selling business opportunities in Maryland. Problem with all that is, just as Rich said, many of these companies, it's not a sinking ship. They resurface as a new entity, a new company name, or spouses or those sales reps, and there's the helm of a new company, and so they sail on.
Thank you, Peggy. To my immediate left is Andre Brock, who's the United States Attorney in Los Angeles. And Andre, we just heard from both Rich and Peggy about business opportunity schemes they're aware of. Peggy talked about instances in which a consumer lost $18,000, will undoubtedly never see any of that money. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the business opportunity fraud cases your office prosecuted, how serious the financial losses have been in those cases, and what kind of relief or convictions you've been able to obtain.
Well, yeah, sure. I mentioned some of them earlier in my earlier remarks, and one of the, I guess, advantages, if you will, is that, we try to devote our resources where we can get the biggest deterrent impact, the biggest impact. And when I'm being blunt, I say I'm talking really about the sentence. We will typically take cases that have a high dollar amount. Anywhere. I hate to say given our dwindling resources, but we're usually talking at fraud schemes that are anywhere from the $2 to $5 million mark at a minimum, and there's a number of reasons for it. We have a number, we've only got about 200 federal criminal prosecutors in our district to represent 18 million people, and so as you can imagine, we have to sort of pick and choose as it relates to the cases, but also because when we do the cases, we have sentencing guidelines that dictate, or at least are a guideline to the court. And oftentimes in these fraud schemes, they're tied to the loss amount. So we want to try to, if we're going to proceed forward, make sure that we get a sentence that we can let the public know that if you commit these kinds of crimes, you will go to prison for a significant amount of time. So, as I mentioned earlier, the individual that had defrauded 87,000 victims, he went to prison for 6 years in federal prison. We've had individuals go to prison for 12 years involving schemes that were in the $39 million, $6.9 million in other instances. So we're really talking about high volume amounts with high sentences. And again, the purpose is because we want to be able to have the press and the public know that if you try to commit these schemes, the federal government's going to be watching, and we're going to try to hold you accountable to the harshest sentence that we can.
Thank you, Andre. Let me next turn to Lois. And Lois, Andre talked about some of the prosecution efforts that they've made, but what other activities are being undertaken to try to protect consumers from these scams? Are there regulatory activities or rules in place that would help protect them? And after Lois, I'm going to come back to Peggy and ask her about her views at the state level.
Well, actually, the FTC now has a wonderful new tool at its disposal. It's a regulatory requirement that requires the seller of a business opportunity to provide a one-page disclosure, streamlined, short, and tidy as it can be, a series of disclosures about who's the seller, what's the nature of the business opportunity, prior litigation that the sellers may have been involved in, and perhaps most critically, if any earnings claims are made, you'll recoup your investment in 6 months, you'll start earning $10,000 a month, anything like that, they've got to provide written substantiation for those claims. And the disclosure document also requires a list of references, so the consumer has at his or her disposal the ability to find out who purchased this most recently and what was their experience. The disclosure requirement took effect just March 1, and I can assure you the FTC, along with our partners at the state and federal level, will be vigorously enforcing it.
Thank you, Lois. And Peggy, how about at the state level? I'm curious what sorts of resources are available for consumers who want to learn more about business opportunities at the state level, and what can they turn to?
Well, we have the Maryland Business Opportunity Sales Act, where it covers. I like the new business opportunity rule. It's expanded in scope. It now covers. Well, first of all, it says they only have to make a payment. Before, the threshold was a payment over $500. Under our law, it's a payment over $300 paid within the first 6 months. Under the new federal law, it now covers those work-at-home schemes. So I think that's really a good thing. Our law does not cover that, but the business opportunities that have traditionally or historically been covered will still continue to register, and they will still be required to file a more in-depth disclosure document that's required under our Act, because it will give greater protection and more disclosures relating to the business opportunity. For example, the very first thing that it would do would be describe what the seller promises to do. It's going to talk about the agreements, sort of what Rich was talking about, and the location assistance, the name of locators, and those types of things. One of the most important disclosures is whether or not they're going to get an exclusive territory. Everybody knows competition is really important. They're going to disclose financing arrangement and cover legend language, but they're going to include a copy of their audited financial statement, not older than 13 months. They're going to include risk factors if it's of a high risk or speculative nature. The most important thing is that they're going to get this disclosure document under the federal rule or state rule, and they're going to get it before they sign or before they pay any money. Under the federal rule, they get it 7 calendar days before they do that. Under Maryland law, it's 10 full business days. And this to allow time for them to review that disclosure and to check it out before they invest.
Great. Thank you, Peggy. So I want to get to Ed, but it looks like we have time for you to ask a question that occurred to me as we were talking. And Lois, maybe this can go to you. Especially, there are a lot of tools here for dealing with the business opportunity problem, the business opportunity fraud problem. What is your experience then from trying to pull those tools together and sort of undertake a coordinated effort to try to stop this?
Well, we've got a pretty impressive track record here, and it's federal, and state, civil, and criminal. In each of the last several years, we have coordinated with our law enforcement partners. We call them sweeps, call them fraud initiatives, to pull together the resources to tackle business opportunity frauds and a whole slew of bottom-dollar frauds. The most recent one was within the last 12 months. We always name them. It was called Empty Promises. No less than 90 actions were filed by the FTC and its law enforcement partners. We think this gives us the ability to have a maximum impact, a visual impact. We get a lot of press coverage, and we always couple the law enforcement activities with a whole consumer education piece.
Okay, and Peggy, I know that you've worked on some of these joint efforts as well. You want to talk about that?
At the state level, we have limited resources for criminal prosecution. However, in many instances, we work with the FTC, the U.S. Attorney, the Inspector General, the Postal Inspector, and even the FBI. And a case comes to my mind where there was such a joint enforcement action. Maryland had initiated an investigation, but we needed some additional assistance, so we went to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Very quickly, the FBI joined in and executed a search and seizure warrant. It resulted in a federal prosecution and a criminal conviction of a 32-year-old Mormon that was sentenced to 30 months in the federal penitentiary.
Thank you. And, before we get to Ed still, because I want to get there, but first, I wonder, what about from a criminal, Ed, you're really being patient, thank you. I wonder about the federal level criminal prosecutions. Are we successful in working together? Have you been successful working together with the states and with the FTC? Rich?
We have. The Department of Justice Consumer Protection Branch has participated in all of the sweeps with the Federal Trade Commission, and the state counterparts. And in fact, over the last several sweeps, we've added our criminal prosecutions up to over 140 criminal prosecutions of business opportunity fraudsters over the last several years. Those have included defendants who have been sentenced to prison terms of a few years. The ringleaders have gotten sentences of 10 years, 15 years, and over 20 years in jail for this sort of fraud. We've had some defendants who are fearful of criminal prosecution and have fled to other countries, and we've been successful at arresting these folks who have fled in countries like Costa Rica and also the Philippines, and these foreign governments have been very cooperative at extraditing these individuals back to the United States for prosecution. So I think it serves a terrific deterrent effect, both the civil and the criminal action.
Yeah. Just like that, look, in our district, I think this is nationwide. In a world of dwindling resources, the task force models seem to work well wherever you are. And quite frankly, most of our big cases we get from our partners at the state or local level or from a regulatory agency, because in some instances, like the case that Peggy described, that can be the tip of the iceberg. That we get some information about a ring that's going on, and we start to build upon it and get into bigger and grander losses that will get to our guideline level and really bring a big impact on the community.
Thank you, Andrew. Now I shift gears slightly, because I'm wondering, return to Ed, and Ed, we've heard about sort of the scams, we've heard about the injury, but who are the victims in these schemes? Are these people who just think they can make money overnight? What do you know about them?
Well, Chuck, I think people should turn to their left, and then they should turn to their right, look at the people sitting here. It's not the other guy. Then look in the mirror. It's people like you and me. It's educated people. It's people who've done their due diligence. As David Vladeck said earlier, in the bad economy that we're facing, we have last dollar scams that target individual consumers for mortgage relief or debt relief. And we also have scams that target people whose jobs have been downsized, people whose spouses have been laid off, retirees whose 401ks read like Stephen King novels because of the crisis Wall Street dumped on us. So it's really everybody. And it's even people that have done their due diligence, as Rich said.
Andre, I assume you're seeing the same thing with your victims?
Well, absolutely. And that's one of the things one of the challenges that we have in trying to get the message out, to get victims to come forward. We recently had a press conference, not so much in the business opportunity realm, but in the residence and relative and distress schemes that were mentioned earlier. But we were able to get 7 folks to come forward. And when you looked at them, one of the persons I actually worked with in the city of Los Angeles in my prior job was a management analyst, college educated, fell for it. And so the challenge, I think, is getting people to come forward to feel that, look, it can happen to anyone. And that's, what we try to do is let people know that.
Thanks, Andre. So I'm assuming that in addition to law enforcement, there's an educational component to all this. And Ed, do you want to talk about what kind of educational efforts you know of or that are being made to try to teach consumers?
Well, briefly, I would tell you that, first of all, I think the Federal Trade Commission's website is the place that I would recommend that consumers start. Just look on their website, ftc.gov, at business opportunity fraud. Obviously, you should also check with your state attorney general. We have the Maryland Attorney General's office here. All your attorneys general are at naag.org. You can find their addresses there or on your state websites. The National Consumers League is here. They have a site, fraud.org, which is very helpful to consumers. And I would really advise people to not pay attention to the information from the people that are working possibly in fraud with the fraudster, but to consider talking to their friends, talking to local consumer groups, and saying, I'm thinking of giving somebody that I don't know $10,000 or $20,000 to make a lot of money. What do you think? And consider hiring an attorney for 1 hour of consultation. But there are a lot of places that I would start, but I would go first to the FTC.
Thanks, Ed. And Lois, I assume you would also encourage people to take a look at that disclosure document if they can get that.
Absolutely. We streamlined it to one page to make it as readable and as accessible as possible, and also to serve as a warning. If you don't get that one-page document, ask for it, and if you get a runaround, leave. But I want to just echo something that Rich and others, Andre, have said. Oftentimes the victims are sophisticated people, and there just is no quick fix here, which is one of the reasons we've got to remain as vigilant as we've been in enforcement in this area.
Thank you, Lois. Let me finally, if the worst happens and people find they have been victimized, what should they do? They think they've discovered they're not going to get their money back. They've lost it. Lois, what are your thoughts?
File a complaint to FTC.gov. There's a reason we have tens of thousands of BizOp complaints, and we use them. We use them. Our law enforcement partners sitting here use them. They all go into a centralized database. Last year, 1.8 million such complaints went into that database. They are an absolute treasure trove. It's a resource that we can use to either develop a case in the first instance, or when we know there's a crook operating out there, to find victims to help us build up the evidence we need to shut them down. And I'd also urge people, obviously, to file complaints with the Better Business Bureau and also their state attorney general.
Peggy,
I would echo that. Both your federal and state regulators, the Attorney General's office also has a website, or you can call us. You're in the right church. It might be the wrong pew. They will forward that call to consumer or to securities or even to other state agencies. We network. We network with other state agencies across the country. We constantly send emails. A lot of the fraud we see comes out of Arizona and Nevada and Utah, and sometimes it's necessary to contact those agencies out there. But the main thing is to report it, to come forward. I know the first question everybody asks, how do I get myself in this? I ask myself that stuff all the time. It's no big deal. There are a lot of people that fall victims to business opportunity fraud. Nothing to be ashamed of. So the real question is, what can I do about it? Now, in Maryland, there is this private right of action to sue, but not just for not registering. There are certain violations. Still, it doesn't mean that they're going to get their money back. But it's important to report it if you know someone has been a victim, because it may prevent more victims. On a final note, I like to say, there's a new kid on the block. We've seen a new company that now contacts the victims and says they can help them get their money back, of course for a fee. So now they become victimized a second time.
Great, thanks. Good cautionary notes. Let me see if Andre, do you want to add anything else here before we close?
I think, briefly, the key thing is to report it, and that has been, quite frankly, the challenge. Many of these folks, after it's happened, they're like, how can I let myself do it? They're too scared to tell their friends about it, and that's what allows the cycle to go on. And I guess the other thing I thought is that, the whole purpose of this roundtable, town hall, if you will, is to develop those relationships and those partnerships. And so, look, I'm coming out here from Los Angeles, and I'm going to take this on the road, if you will, to Los Angeles, convene a meeting like this, because, quite frankly, you are the vehicle by which we can get the word out to the streets, to the churches, the different community groups, et cetera, to let them know. I mean, look, these are great websites and tools, but if no one even knows to go to ftc.gov, they won't know where to file a complaint. But if you take that message out to your community groups that, look, here are some things that are going on, and ask us to come to you and give a presentation. I mean, we have a community relations specialist in our office. That is her purpose, their team's purpose, is to get out there and spread the message of what our agencies do to provide that service. Because at the end of the day, we're about protecting communities, but as I said earlier, we're only as good as the information that we get. And so it's a two-way street. And so I would just strongly encourage you to take us up on that offer. I mean, the Attorney General and Tony West and Lanny Brewer were serious about engaging in that continuing dialogue. This is not a one-time meeting.
Great. Okay, and I think on that note, that very forceful and powerful note, I should say, I think we'll stop here and turn it back over to our host. Thank you.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. That ends our panel sessions. I think what you saw here today with this summit, the three panelists and the remarks by the Attorney General and the other co-chairs of the Consumer Protection Working Group really best exemplify what this Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force is all about. It's a mechanism to allow all the different federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and offices, inspectors general, state attorneys general, and others involved in this area to get together and share information, share best practices, and talk about how we can do better, how we can help prevent fraud from occurring in the first place, and when it does occur, how we can increase our enforcement efforts. And I think what you saw today is a good example of that in action. As many people have said, this is not an end, but a beginning. We're going to continue to work together. As the Attorney General has said on a few occasions in the past, the schemes, in particular consumer fraud schemes and other financial fraud schemes, are as diverse as the imaginations as those who perpetrate them, and as sophisticated as modern technology will allow. Well, we are on to those schemes, and we're going to continue to pursue them and protect the American consumers and others from being victims of financial fraud. And we thank you all for your attention here today. Thank you.